Hello everyone, my name's Becky Needham and I am Road Safety Officer for England at RoSPA. Last financial year we were funded by the Department for Transport to conduct an evaluation of pedestrian training provision to help us to understand what types of pedestrian training are most effective. In my short presentation I wanted to talk through the research we commissioned, some of the findings of the study and our next steps. Just to cover the rationale of the research first, so despite road accidents being one of the leading causes of accidental death for children aged 6 to 11, in 2019 through a survey we commissioned, we identified that almost half of children had not received any form of pedestrian training in the last 12 months. And we'd imagine that that figure's higher at the moment because COVID restrictions is likely to have led to lots of schools cancelling their road safety training over the last year. The current picture is that local authorities have a responsibility for child road safety, but there's a lot of variability in what road safety officers are able to provide, and there's no national pedestrian training scheme that would provide learning outcomes and quality standards. So in terms of what's offered, some local authorities have a comprehensive package that develops pedestrian training skills over several years. Some might involve training on the roads and others are based solely in the classroom. It also varies in terms of who delivers the training, so some would rely on teachers or parent volunteers to deliver the training, and there's variability in how these people are trained. The differences in the training offered has to be considered against the backdrop of children becoming more independent as they get older and the spike in casualties in older children. For example, in 2020, the statistics released by the DFT showed that 70% of child pedestrians were aged 8 to 15, and it is quite concerning to us that some children might not be receiving any pedestrian training at all, other than what their parents are able to teach them. So as with road safety interventions more broadly, very few have robust evaluations of their effectiveness, and even fewer will have an evaluation that identifies the mechanism through which any effects are achieved. As a result, RoSPA commissioned Brainbox Research and Childwise to conduct some research that will start to address this gap. So this slide shows a timeline of how the project worked through from the baseline data collection through to the intervention being delivered and post-intervention data collection, which I'll explain in a bit more detail on the next slide. So looking at the cohort involved in our research, we aimed to recruit 3 schools to the evaluation. The first was delivering training that takes place both in the classroom and on the roads. One would deliver classroom-based road safety training and no on-road training. And then one group would not be delivering any road safety training during the study period, and that would be known as the control group. The criteria was that children could be in years 3 or 4, and for those not in the control school, they would be receiving pedestrian road safety training during the study period. The opportunity actually arose to include a 4th school that had delivered on-street training during the previous year and were receiving some classroom training in the form of a reminder booklet during the study period. So in essence, we wanted to compare knowledge between these groups at 2 time points to determine the most effective form of pedestrian training. We designed a mixed methods approach that involved both quantitative and qualitative elements. The quantitative research, which used a survey, enabled us to identify any changes in children's road safety knowledge after the different types of training. The survey included 16 questions, and what these questions addressed was the main points covered in pedestrian road safety training. So that included things like finding a safe place to cross the road, crossing the road itself, and using pedestrian crossings such as zebra and pelican crossings. And it was designed to measure children's knowledge of how to safely cross the road. The possible scores for this survey ranged from 0 to 20. And what we also did within this survey was to explore children's feelings about crossing the road. And we collected this data from the children both before and after receiving their training. Survey data collection was scheduled to take place before the training in November 2020 and again afterwards in January 2021. Unfortunately, the lockdown imposed in January meant that it was very, very difficult to collect the follow-up data in schools. So with uncertainty about when schools would return, we asked that Brainbox Research and Childwise would work with the schools to collect the data from the children who were still attending school and, where possible, children who were at home too. So what we found was that we managed to collect 319 responses before the training, but just 155 afterwards. We also used some qualitative research methods with children and teachers, which provided us with an opportunity to explore in detail how it is that children can apply what they learn. We had planned to complete face-to-face cognitive walks with the children, but with the closure of schools and the social distancing requirements, this meant that this wasn't possible to take place in the format we'd planned. So when children returned to school in March, the social distancing did remain in place. And so instead of doing face-to-face walks with a researcher and child, we recorded a video of a walk along roads that included the typical hazards that children might encounter. So these included things like walking along a pavement with driveways, crossing the road, crossing between parked cars, crossing at junctions and using a traffic island. 13 of the children viewed the video with the researcher, and they talked through with the researcher what they would be looking for and what they would do if they were walking that route. And then these interviews were recorded and analysed, and this allowed us to explore how much children recalled and understood the road safety rules that they'd been taught during their training. We also conducted interviews with 2 of the teachers who had been involved in delivering the training and the road safety officer who delivered the classroom plus on-road training. Coming on to what we found, even at baseline before the training, most children were aware of the need to stop, look and listen before crossing the road. Most knew how to use pelican and zebra crossings and traffic islands, but we did find that there were very few who could identify the safest place to cross if they needed to cross between parked cars, or where they should stand while they were waiting to cross the road. And children's knowledge of crossing roads and junctions did improve after the training, but what we did notice was that some knowledge gaps, such as crossing between parked cars, persisted. As part of the survey, children were asked to choose words that would best describe how they would feel if they were crossing the road without an adult. So before the training, the most frequent choice was feeling unsafe, followed by feeling worried and careful, but only 13% of the children reported that they would feel safe doing that. And although the majority of children did pick unsafe before and after their training, the results show that there was a small increase in positive feelings, such as feeling careful and safe, and a decrease in negative feelings, such as feeling scared or worried after the training, and that's shown on the graph on the right. After the training, when we looked at the knowledge scores for the questionnaire, what we can see was that there were significant differences between the control school, who'd had no training, and all of the others who had, which did indicate that both classroom and on-road training and classroom-only training are effective in increasing road safety knowledge scores. Unfortunately, there's no statistically significant difference between schools receiving different types of training. However, we do think that any difference might have been masked due to the lower than planned numbers of the completed questionnaires at time 2. Interviews with the teacher and the road safety officer who delivered the training suggested that there are advantages of training that does have some on-road elements. So these include demonstrating the skills to children, children being able to recognise the relevance of that training, and also the ability to identify children who might need that little bit of extra support or practice. The interviews also highlighted that in some cases parents were not demonstrating good practice when they were out on the roads with their children. We've picked out some quotes from the interviews on the right that highlight this. Exploring what we found in the virtual cognitive walks, the findings suggested that there are advantages of road safety training that's delivered on the road as well as in the classroom. We found that the children who had received both classroom and on-road training recalled more, and they had a greater understanding of the kinds of things that they should be looking for on the roads. There was a lot more variability in the children who had had only classroom training and those who didn't have any training at all. And this variability, particularly in the control group, we would imagine could reflect how much parents have taught the children about road safety. So thinking about where we are now that this piece of work has been completed, we've had a notification from the Department for Transport that we've secured some more funding to develop on this work. So this year, acting on the findings of our evaluation, what we're planning to do is to commission an organisation that specialises in developing education interventions. And what we'd like them to do for us is to help us to develop a pedestrian training scheme that's targeted at children in years 3 to 4 based on best practice. And we would envision that that scheme would consist of resources to aid pedestrian training, and that would be targeted at teachers, road safety officers and the child. And there'd also be information on how to conduct the pedestrian training. What we'll then look to do is to pilot the scheme at a number of schools, working alongside an independent evaluation expert. The evaluation of the pilot scheme, much like the evaluation of the scheme I've described, would look at knowledge-based surveys of road safety skills for children before and after they've received their training, cognitive walks with children and interviews with those delivering the training. What we would then do is produce a report, and that would detail the effectiveness of the pilot scheme and the changes that would need to be made to the scheme before it's rolled out further. As part of this, we'd also invest in communications, including developing social media assets to promote the project and its findings. In the longer term, we will be looking at how we can refine and improve the scheme that we create and exploring more depth of how a national standard can be created to deliver pedestrian training scheme that's being properly evaluated and to ensure that every child has that opportunity to receive pedestrian training at school. So that's a really brief overview of the project, findings and the next steps. My contact details are on screen if you'd like to get in touch with me about the project, and I'd like to thank you for listening.